Good afternoon. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And welcome to this second in our series of roundtables, sextet, about sexuality. Last week we... Sextet, yeah. I'm not responsible for that. Last week we started with mating in captivity. As Ed Nersessian so cogently pointed out last week, we've continued our multidisciplinary approach in the formulation of these particular roundtables, in that we have a lap dancer who has a PhD in anthropology from Michigan, appearing on our voyeurism panel. And our paraphilias panel, we have a dominatrix who has no advanced degrees.
She wasn't originally trained as a chef.
Okay, she was originally trained as a chef. Now, before we start this afternoon's panel, I did want to call your attention to something that the art on this walls is from an exhibition curated by Hallie Cohn and assisted by Adam Ludwig, called The Body as Image, in which literally it's a literal and figurative backdrop for many of the themes in this particular series of roundtables. And the 8 artists explore diversity and occasionally perversity, as you will note in some of the images. But really, people who come to the Philoctetes Center often don't take a look at what's on the walls because of the fact that we have so much going on in the center of the floor. So I urge you to, afterwards, take a look at some of the paintings, which are really extraordinary, and also to go into I invite you to go into our annex and see more about those works and read the material written about them. I'm now pleased to introduce Donald Pfaff. Dr. Pfaff is professor and head of the Laboratory of Neurobiology and Behavior at the Rockefeller University. He is a brain scientist who uses neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological methods to study the cellular mechanisms by which the brain controls behavior. Dr. Pfaff is a fellow of the New York Academy of Sciences, a member of the advisory board of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and serves on the editorial boards of numerous scholarly journals. Dr. Pfaff will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. So, thank you.
Thanks. So, nothing as exotic as lap dancers. But I just did a quick calculation as we were being introduced, and I do think we have something over 200 years of experience among us in the field, in the subjects that we're going to talk about today. Everybody's prepared to be both expert in their own field and open-minded about everything else. I'd like to start with Michael Baum, who's a professor at Boston University. He was a longtime editor of the journal Hormones and Behavior. There's a few areas in work in hormones and behavior that he hasn't worked on, but not many. And so we'll start there. Michael Numan has written a beautiful book about parental behavior in experimental animals and in people. Parental behavior when it works successfully, and also parental behavior when it doesn't work so well. Is that right? Yeah. And he's a professor at Boston College. I'm at Rockefeller University. Hiroaki Matsunami is using techniques that didn't exist when I started my career, molecular genetic techniques, and he's going to talk to us about lots of things, but including olfactory physiology. Helen Fisher is a widely published anthropologist. Her breakthrough book was The Anatomy of Sex, The Anatomy of Love. Yeah, some years ago. And a more recent book is Why We Love. And Siri Gullestad, whose name I promised to mispronounce, is here from Oslo, Norway. And she's head of her department there, and she is the former president of the Norwegian Psychoanalytic Society. So let's get started. I wanted to start with the laboratory science and broaden out from there, because we laboratory scientists tend to go into small rooms, often small dark rooms, and we don't come out for hours, and we speak in jargon and undefined abbreviations. And I thought if we started with the laboratory science and talk a little bit about that, and then we broaden out from there, it would work better. So, Mike, what would you like to talk about in terms of male sexuality?
Well, let me just preface that by saying that obviously there are males and females, mm-hmm. and one of the huge issues in behavioral endocrinology is how the ability to show male typical and female sexual behaviors develops. Why are male and female individuals interested in the opposite sex, for example. And once they find the opposite sex, what are the ways that the brain and the hormone system in the body interact to control those behaviors? So probably the earliest experiments in behavioral endocrinology, that's the study of the way that hormones affect behavior, were carried out in the mid-19th century when people found that if you actually remove the testes of chickens, you eliminate mating behavior, and you eliminate the comb, the red comb. And this is an endocrine effect, an androgen effect. The testosterone secreted by the testes, if you replace that hormone, will stimulate behavior and will make the comb grow. Well, there's been now 150 years of research since then, and we still know that testosterone is really important for male sexual behavior. Prepubertal boys typically are less likely to show sexual behavior than kids that go through puberty. Old men, as their testosterone levels reduce with age, tend to become less sexually motivated. That doesn't mean they can't fall in love, and we can talk about some of the distinctions between this basic physiology and some more human attributes, which I would say love is one of them. The other major effect of testosterone is an effect in mammals, including man, as far as we know, that we've studied in animals and mice. I've worked on ferrets for many years. Some people work on monkeys, not too many these days, but there are different animal models that you use because you can do experiments in animals you can't do in people, which have shown that during development, there is a period in the male nervous system when testosterone actually literally organizes the structure of the brain. So it, as a result of being there in us, it's during fetal life. In a rat or a mouse, it's over the first few 10 days of life. That as a consequence of males having testes that make testosterone, our brains as males are wired in a way that is different, literally, from what happens in females. And one of the consequences of that is the fact that males then are, on average, more likely to be interested in the attributes of a female, and this is crucial, of course, for sexual attraction and reproduction. And what I have spent my life doing is trying to work out the details of why it is male nervous systems, having been wired by testosterone early in life, then for the rest of that male's life, will seek out cues. In animals like mice, it's usually olfactory cues. Our sense of smell is crucial if you're a rodent. In people, perhaps, there's a lot of controversy, we'll hear about this later, I'm sure, whether there are pheromones or these odor cues that provoke sexual attraction and arousal in people. There's a lot of debate about that. Less debate about the role of visual cues in human beings. But again, males and females typically have different responses to visual cues that will lead to sexual attraction. And that's the first stage in becoming attached to another person, in a romantic context at least, is this attraction. Mm-hmm. And there's a big research base that we can perhaps delve into here and there, which dwells on the details about how the wiring in the brain differs in males and females, in those parts of the brain that control sexual attraction, and in those parts of the brain that control actual mating behavior per se, which is very different. Certainly in rodents, very different in the male and female. Well, in the human too, although there's some, body parts move, but there are different bits and pieces of the body. I might add that the male genitalia, for example, are also totally dependent during development on the actions of testosterone, this hormone that's so critical for brain sexual differentiation. So males are different from females for a good reason. There's a hormonal mechanism that acts in the brain, wires the brain so that it's permanently different, and it's not the entire brain, but specific parts of the brain. Primarily the ancient, deepest parts of the brain, the hypothalamus, and also bits of the brain that feed information into the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and probably also parts of the olfactory nervous system are sexually differentiated as well. And all of those bits of brain interact, and there's human data as well, and I'm sure Helen knows, from fMRI studies, PET scan studies, suggesting that even in people, we have evidence that these old ancient parts of the nervous system are controlling certainly things like sexual arousal and sexual attraction, and perhaps also romantic attraction and bonding as well. Although those data are harder to come by in human studies, we haven't had the technology long enough to allow us to do those kinds of experiments, in contrast to the animal literature that we have.
I don't know how many people in this room know that testosterone has some, but not all of its effects in the brain by virtue of its chemical conversion to estradiol.
Right.
Estrogens.
So the estrogen, classically people think that estrogen is a female hormone, and it is. But oh, by the way, during development, certainly we have a lot of evidence in rodents and ferrets and non-primate mammals that it's during development in the brain itself, it takes testosterone from the circulation secreted by the testes, and there's an enzyme that converts it to estradiol, and then there's a whole pathway of gene expression that's altered by that estrogen signal. There's a lot of controversy about whether that applies to man, and that not very good evidence that it does, in fact. That instead androgen itself may be the effective compound. But that's still an area of controversy, unresolved.
So, of course, I know more about effects of female typical sex hormones on the brain. And I think more of things that the female can do that the male can't. And so when that testosterone in the neonatal period, just around the time of birth in a laboratory animal, hits the brain, and during human pregnancy, about when is that anyway?
Well, it's by the end of the first trimester.
End of the first trimester, it would hit the baby boy's brain. Most of the things I think about are the subsequent failure of the genetic male to show any kind of female typical sex behavior, which is quite striking. And also, the male brain cannot organize ovulation. It's quite a delicate endocrine dance, a dance among the hormones, in order to allow the pituitary to send a pulse of hormones down to the ovaries and cause ovulation. And the male brain just cannot do that. So Mike and I have been talking mainly about hormones, and most of you will know that hormone comes from the Greek word for messenger. It's a messenger from one organ in the body into the bloodstream, up the bloodstream, and to another organ in the body. But a friend of ours out in California named Arthur Arnold has come up with a completely different type of explanation of sex differences in experimental animals. He's saying that in addition to the hormones coming up and affecting the brain, there's also a direct genetic influence that would have to come from the Y chromosome, right?
Or a dosing of the X chromosome. Or a different dosing of the X chromosome.
Or a different dosing of the X chromosome, which I'll explain in a minute. In order to, that these direct genetic changes between the male and the female affect behavior directly. And that's also a current controversial area. What Mike said there for a minute is that ordinarily we think of the huge X chromosome and the tiny Y chromosome. The Y has been shrinking through evolution for probably a lot of people think that's a good idea. With the tiny Y chromosome, and I was willing to say Art Arnold's influence had something to do with this Y chromosome, but Mike has pointed out that in the female, you have two X chromosomes, and it's necessary for one of the X parts of one of the X to get deactivated, so you don't have a double dose. You only want a regular normal dose of each protein. And the details of that X inactivation are more complicated than anybody thought about. So you'll be reading about that for the next 10 or 15 years. So we're talking about libidinal sex behavior. And over here in the laboratory at Boston College, we've got a guy that studies, Michael Numan, who studies a much more sort of acculturated form of behavior, which would be parental behavior. And with female sex behaviors, you have a long-term preparation by estrogens, and then you have a pulse of progesterone, and that pulse of progesterone causes ovulation, organized by the brain, and causes female sex behavior. It's brutally simple, but you've got something more complicated.
Well, one, we can say you could love a partner in terms of romance, and you can love your child. So we could be dealing with maternal love versus romantic love, and maybe there are some similarities there. As Don indicated, I study how hormones in the brain control maternal responding, how a mother takes care of her babies, my subjects are rats. And so normally when I give a talk, even to colleagues in the area, they always say, well, gee, if you're studying rats, can this really be relevant to humans? And of course, I'm interested in human maternal behavior, and that I would think the government is giving me money to do this kind of research because it has relevance, and we're not playing. And so what I kind of say is that maternal behavior is a defining characteristic of mammals. That's one of the ways we define mammals: lactate. Okay? And therefore you would expect that there's going to be some core central structures in the brain that are going to be very basic, that have been conserved across evolutionary time, that are going to be present in humans and present in other primates and present in rats. And so I hope that the research I'm discovering in rats is going to be applicable and ultimately give some insight into why things like child abuse and child neglect occur. Okay, so now what's the standard response of a female to babies? So when you look at all mammals, what's the typical response? The typical response is if you have a non-pregnant female and you present her with an infant animal, if it's sheep, a lamb, if it's rats, we call the babies pups. What she would normally do is avoid them or reject them or even attack them. But a postpartum female, when she just gives birth, she will take care of her own or other young. So it's not this idea that when we give a virgin or a non-pregnant female an infant, that it's not hers. Because any animal, when it gives birth, will take care immediately of its own or any alien. We call them alien infants. So what is causing this change? What is causing this movement from not being maternally reactive to being maternally reactive? And it's the action of the pregnancy hormones on the brain. Some of the critical pregnancy hormones, I'll just name a few, are estradiol or estrogen, which we mentioned. So estrogen can be important for female sexual behavior, male sexual behavior, but at certain times, in certain parts of the brain, it's also important for maternal behavior. Estrogen is important. A pituitary hormone named prolactin, which gets its name because it stimulates lactation, can also act on the brain to stimulate maternal behavior. And then there's another chemical that people sometimes call a hormone, because it is oxytocin. Oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary. It causes milk ejection, it causes uterine contractions, but it has very poor penetrance through the blood-brain barrier. It doesn't get into the brain very well. But oxytocin is also released in the brain by neurons, and it acts as a neurotransmitter. So one of the things to think of even is to say, gee, look, you have these hormones or peptides which can do something peripherally: lactation, uterine contractions during labor, milk ejection, and yet they act on, and you would think, well, maybe what their behavioral effects would be adapted to, or what their physiological effects are, and maternal behavior certainly is related to lactation and uterine contractions. Now that's the typical response. These hormones are important, but we know that paternal behavior occurs in some species. And we know that something called alloparental behavior occurs, where in some species, organisms which aren't postpartum will take care of babies. It's not typical, but one of the things we're interested in, what are the exceptions? So in mammals, paternal behavior is very, very rare. The common form of parenting is just maternal behavior, but some species show paternal behavior, including us. And we all know that we can adopt. So we can adopt babies. We don't have to go through pregnancy. We can adopt. That would be an example of kind of alloparental behavior in us. Because, all I can say is that evolution can work on the brain so that the hormones may become less important in certain species, but probably the same brain areas are involved. And evidence indicates that that's indeed the case. Now, what are the important brain areas? It seems like there's this little nucleus, very small, in the very front part of the hypothalamus. And it's called the medial preoptic area. Now, for people who don't know anatomy, you say, well, vision, what does vision have to do with maternal behavior? Because it has optic in it, it has nothing to do with vision. A medial preoptic area means that it's just in front of the optic chiasm when the optic nerves cross under the brain. It seems like in species that need hormones, estradiol, prolactin, and oxytocin all act on the medial preoptic area at the end of pregnancy. And it changes the way those neurons work. and it activates circuits which then promote maternal acceptance and depress maternal avoidance of young. Okay? And so what happens is we get this projection, and I'm going to bring up some brain areas that I think Helen Fisher will bring up, so I want to mention them because you might hear them. And I've mapped out a circuit, and some of the evidence is excellent, and some of the evidence is kind of more on a proposal end of things. But it seems like there's this projection of estrogen-binding neurons and oxytocin-binding neurons in the medial preoptic area that project to a part of the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area. And it gives rise to an ascending dopamine system. And a lot of people who are even not in the literature think of dopamine and reward. Okay? And it seems to activate this dopamine system, which then projects back up to an area called the nucleus accumbens, and the nucleus accumbens projects to an area called the ventral pallidum. So I've mapped out this circuit from the preoptic area to the ventral tegmental area, the role of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and then the involvement of the ventral pallidum. They all seem to be important for maternal behavior, but they may also be important for other social behaviors as well. And now I do want to say one thing before I say a little bit about the relevance of this little circuit. Some species form paternal, please. So I am a human. Certain species form selective attachments to their babies, and others don't. So, for example, we feel that we love our baby, and we wouldn't really go out of our way unless it was in an emergency to take care of someone else's babies. We're relatively attached to our own children. And for example, lambs and most ungulates, horses, sheep, goats, as soon as the baby is born, they'll take care of any baby. Okay? But then once they kind of interact with that baby, some kind of learning takes place in the olfactory bulb and other parts of the brain. And then they form an attachment to that baby, and they'll only take care of their own and not someone else's. Of course, you can switch at the time of birth, and they'll take care of a foster young as long as that's the one they're exposed to. Rats don't do that. Rats will take care of any babies all the time. So some people have said, well, gee, rats are kind of crude. They don't form attachments. It's not the same kind of maternal love as people have. What I would say is that rats don't need to form attachments. That doesn't mean they don't love their babies as much. They just don't need to form attachments because their babies don't wander away from the nest. Their babies are little, tiny, helpless. They stay in the nest. All the mother has to know is where the nest is.
But also, isn't the investment kind of so much lower in a rat compared to a sheep?
Right.
You have this huge...
Right, but she has a lot of pups. But I think it's more the fact that they don't need to form an attachment because the pups aren't mobile.
Okay.
And the pups... Now, there are examples of some squirrels where the mother keeps caring for the babies after they're weaned. Now, and in that case, once the babies leave the burrow, that she forms an attachment in that time and will only take care of the baby when it comes back in again and not a stranger. So even rodents, under certain conditions, will form attachments if the babies end up being mobile.
Mike, when maternal behavior fails, how do you think about that, either in neuronal terms or hormonal terms?
Okay, I want to...
You're going to get to that,
Yeah,
and especially the role of fear and anxiety. Too.
Right, I want to do that. I want to go over these now. I want to kind of...
In the New York papers, we've read about a girl in New Jersey, as I recall, in the halftime of the senior prom, she put her baby, is that right, in the garbage? Yeah, some of the examples that we read about in the papers, I'm sure it doesn't happen in Massachusetts, are really horrific. And since you have conceived of that in your book, and also there are experiments about it, maybe you can enlighten us a little bit.
What I want to do, I wanted to bring that up in starting with Harry Harlow's early work. So Harry Harlow was Harry Harlow studied a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s and 70s, and he studied what was called motherless mother monkeys. He raised rhesus monkeys without their mothers. Humans raised them, but they didn't get proper maternal care, and he raised them for 6 months like that, and then he studied their social behavior and their maternal behavior afterwards. What happened was, one, there was a general disruption of social behavior in general. They couldn't integrate back into a group. Okay, and but also, if they were fertilized, they were either force mated with a male or they were artificially fertilized with sperm so that when they gave birth, they wouldn't take care of their babies. They abused their babies. And so one idea was that this kind of, one little interesting idea, and it's kind of Freudian in a way, is that the interaction of a baby with its mother may be the core of all subsequent social behaviors. Now, in terms of fear or anxiety, what was it about these animals? Well, they tend to show high stress responsiveness, high anxiety, how you measure that behaviorally and hormonally in a rhesus monkey, very high levels of anxiety. And so some people have suggested, and one possibility is that when animals are so fearful, any stimulus, so you give birth for the first time, any stimulus is so fearful and you get freaked out by it and you don't take care of the baby. But I want to maybe go a little bit beyond that and say that it's possible that some aspects of the way you're cared for by your mother actually affect the maternal circuits, not necessarily the fear circuits. I think they're both affected. I think it's a combination of things. But not only could you get increased anxiety or fearfulness, but also maybe this preoptic area, projection to this ventral this dopamine system, maybe that gets disrupted. So I want to talk about some interesting work, and I'll end with this. Some interesting work by Frances Champagne, who's here at Columbia University, and Michael Meany. So Frances did her PhD with Michael Meany at McGill, and then she came here at Columbia, and she's doing some very interesting work. Now, this is not work on abusive maternal behavior, but what she ends up doing is she ends up saying some mothers seem to be more attentive to their babies than others. These are natural variations. All the mothers raise their babies to weaning. They grow up. They seem to be okay, but I'll tell you some of their differences. Okay, but some of the mothers lick and groom and take care and nurse their pups in a certain way, more so than the others. And so she calls one group high licking and grooming, another group low licking and grooming. And I just kind of say, why don't we see this as a matter of how attentive the mother is to the baby? Okay. Now, what she finds is that the high licking and grooming mothers have pups that when the pups grow up and they're adult, they become high licking and grooming mothers. And the low licking and grooming mothers, when they grow up, they become the pups become low licking. You might say, well, it's genetic. They've just inherited the genes from the mother. But she cross fosters. She can take pups that are born to a low licking and grooming mother, at my day of birth, cross foster them to a high licking and grooming mother. They grow up high licking and grooming.
I just want to clarify that. So the point you were making there is that basically it's not just the recipient of the maternal care that affects their future maternal.
So the maternal care that they're getting is in some way affecting their brain development, so that when they grow up, their maternal care mirrors the mother's maternal care. Now, what about the brain? The animals that get low licking and grooming have fewer estrogen receptors in their medial preoptic area, fewer oxytocin receptors in their medial preoptic area, and less dopamine release into the nucleus accumbens. It's amazing. And so the issue here then is that if you weren't just getting low licking and grooming, but you were really neglected by your parents, could this really affect this core circuitry in some way? And this is what gives rise to what people say in the human literature, the transgenerational effects of maternal behavior on subsequent maternal behavior of the offspring, that it goes across generations. And it seems to be partly due to experience. The last thing to indicate is that these animals not only show the poor maternal behavior and the decrease in oxytocin receptors and estrogen receptors, they also show increased anxiety. So there could be this relationship between increased anxiety and decreased maternal behavior and decreased preoptic function, and together those two things can really disrupt the behavior.
So we've been talking about behaviors which in lower animals, these loving behaviors and sex behaviors and maternal behaviors involve olfaction in a big way. And in 1991, there was a striking development, and Hiroaki represents the molecular genetic tradition that comes from this development, where Linda Buck and Richard Axel discovered the genes that code for the odor receptors in a variety of animals, including human beings. And that was on the west side. I didn't hear about it for quite a while because I work on the east side. But suffice it to say that that's been an incredible development where basic molecular genetics can speak to a sensory system that's important for these primitive behaviors. And Hiroaki works on exactly that. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about olfaction.
Sure. So we are working on how we smell thousands of different chemicals, how we can discriminate minute differences in the chemical structure to perceive some chemicals as pleasant, other chemicals as unpleasant. I actually brought one of the chemicals here to test you guys. And so this chemical is called androstenol, okay? And to me, it smells nothing. But I know about half of you, or maybe 70% of you, can smell it.
So I'll just say that this androstenone is a steroid.
Yes.
And we all hear about steroids. Everybody that reads about athletics is hearing about steroids. All steroids are relatively simple, very rigid, planar molecules. And they start with cholesterol. The synthesis of cholesterol actually is like a miracle, because you have this tremendously long chain of things, and if you fold it in a certain way, you can see that a single chemical reaction turns it into cholesterol. And then after cholesterol, all of steroid hormones, stress hormones, sex hormones of all sorts, represent taking little groups off the edge of that flat planar molecule. And androstenone is closely related to male sex hormones.
Hormone testosterone.
Yeah.
Yes, so, okay, so I'll just pass it, okay? So the reason why I brought here, you can smell it? Okay. Is that this androstenone is advertised as human pheromones. You hear about this word pheromone very often. Pheromones are chemicals that influence innate behavior or hormonal levels coming from the same species. So if you're feeling something from a cat, that's not pheromones, that's something else. Any case, and it's interesting because only a subset of people can smell it. And it is actually very common for people to perceive the same chemical differently. This is one example. Other examples include cilantro, and maybe some people like the smell of cilantro, other people hate it. Smell of gasoline, some people may hate it, other people like, and many other chemicals. And actually, we are studying how genetic differences on our genome can explain some of these differences. As you may know, human genome sequences has been read and it's being intensively analyzed by thousands of researchers around the world. We now know that there are about 25,000 genes encoding human genome in the human genome. But two of the things that I want to mention is that over 1% of the whole gene is devoted to encode receptors to sense odorants. So about 400 genes are encoded odorant receptors that are produced by olfactory neurons in the olfactory epithelium of the nose. And the other thing we have noticed by sequencing multiple individuals is that about 0.1% of the total sequence is actually different from one person to the other. You may think 0.1% is small, but if you think about that there are 3 billion letters in the human genome, there are actually millions of differences between one person to the other. So,
You mean in terms of smell?
no, in terms of general gene sequences, including smell receptors. Okay? So that difference can explain a lot of differences, not only the differences in smell ability, but also personality and susceptibility to various disease, including cancer and diabetes and other things, and so on. So that's an intensely studied area. But what we are studying is focusing on the differences in the genes devoted to the smell of odorants. Okay. And
So one of the reasons you sent this around, the androstenone, is that there have been some reports that males and females. So are we going to do statistics here?
well, I mean, if we,
It sets it up for a chi-square very nicely. Yeah.
Yes. When we do studies, yes, we do a lot of statistics, but I don't do mathematics now. I only talk about what we find.
Yeah.
Basically, for androstenone, we found a particular gene that encodes one odorant receptor gene, so out of these 400 odorant receptor genes, that is different between individuals. So we can call it something like type A and type B. So these are the same genes, but one person may have A, because one have two chromosomes, one from your father, one from your mother, right? And so one person can have A type, another person can have a B type, other person can have B type. And what we found was that people who have this A type are likely to be able to smell this chemical and likely to perceive it as unpleasant and describe this chemical as sweaty or urine or a sickening kind of smell. On the other hand, if you have B type or AB type, you're more likely to sense it less intensely, I should say, and you're likely to describe it as more like vanilla and sweet. So that is the first example that we show that a particular gene can actually affect the perception to a certain kind of smell.
Yeah.
And this must be the first example. We will find, we're likely to find many more examples of differences in different types of receptor genes that would explain why we have different opinions in terms of which smell we like or not.
Before throwing this over to Helen, and where she can make us get real and talk about the species we care about most, maybe Mike would like to give us a lightning tour of the pathways as we come from Hiroaki's receptors into the brain.
Well, I mean, in your case, these receptors are in our main olfactory epithelium,
Yes.
which we, as human beings, have. Lower mammals, non-primate mammals, also have another set of receptors that are classically labeled pheromone receptors, which are in a structure in the roof of the mouth called the vomeronasal organ, which extends axons back to a little subset of neurons in the accessory olfactory bulb. And one of the big kind of controversies is whether or not people actually respond to pheromones. I mean, in your case, no one yet has really shown that there is a human pheromone that meets all the criteria that you articulated.
That is correct.
At least I don't think there is. I don't know what your opinion may be, but I'm sure you'll tell us. But there's a lot of controversy because most people would argue who know about these things that the human being probably lacks a functional vomeronasal system, which has classically been said to be the pheromone detecting organs. My own work recently has actually addressed this issue in mice, and we've recently shown that actually there are parts of the main olfactory system that take information from the classic main olfactory bulb and put it down into the part of the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that receives inputs from the vomeronasal system, also in mice, which may be an avenue whereby even in mice, this classic main olfactory system that we also have as people is receiving information about social odorants, maybe pheromones.
Yes, I agree with you. Yes, this second olfactory organ, vomeronasal organ, is probably a vestigial organ in humans, and it's been advocated that the vomeronasal organ is an organ to sense pheromones, but it's likely that vomeronasal organ is not the only organ to sense pheromones. In fact, a part of the main olfactory epithelium, which we possess, are also responsible to sense pheromones. And actually, this androstenone is a well-established pheromone in pigs. And in pigs, it's secreted from male saliva. And when females are in heat, if the female sense androstenone, it basically displays a specific behavior that would promote the copulation. Okay. Well, that is one of the reasons why, if you Google androstenone, you see a lot of pheromone androstenone connection, and people are selling androstenone as human pheromones.
What's the behavior?
But in the case of pig, it's shown that the main olfactory epithelium is responsible to sense androstenone to make this stereotypical behavioral output.
What's the behavior?
So basically, the female do not move.
Well, there are two behaviors, really. I mean,
Okay,
first of
so you
all,
know
the female pig will be attracted to the odor. It'll move across space to be in the presence of a male, or if the male's absent, you just put some androstenone over there, it'll run over to it and investigate it. But farmers use this to identify which of the sows are actually in heat, because there are no external signs of this. They just spray some of this on the nose of this animal, and they stand rigidly. Well, that's more like a rat, which Don studies. The pig kind of stands immobile and allows the male to have sex with her. So you have to have a male there to see that this is actually going on. Or the farmer can actually put his hand on the rump of the pig, and ordinarily she'll scoot out of the way, but in this case she'll just stand immobile. And that's a pheromone. That's probably the best widely agreed upon example of a higher mammal that shows a pheromone response. And again, it's mediated, as you say, by the main olfactory, not the vomeronasal system. So this is what intrigues so many human researchers. They say, well, there are lots of precedents now, even in mice and pigs, for main olfactory systems, which people have. Perhaps there are pheromone effects in people. But I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that visual stimuli probably have taken the place of olfactory stimuli as stimuli that lead to attraction, which is the topic of this afternoon's conversation, and also bonding. I mean, when you have, maybe have you looked at the visual part of the nervous system in your imaging studies? And
well, there's because we're using photographs. You're looking at a photograph of a person you're in love with, and also a photograph of somebody who's neutral, and so that.
So these are visual stimuli. So you start with the visual
absolutely.
stimulus.
Sure, they call it love at first sight, not love at first smell.
Right, exactly. but we hope, those of us who work on smell, hope that those circuits that we're looking at deeper in the brain, the amygdala, for example, the hypothalamus, maybe those are commonality parts of the circuitry in these lower animals. We start with an olfactory input. We have to have a sensory stimulus of some sort to start with. In mice and pigs, it's an olfactory stimulus. In us, it's a visual stimulus. But ultimately, these can still be directed to the same parts of the amygdala and the hypothalamus in ways that these ancient parts of the brain that can control sexual attraction. So by using, we do our experiments in mice and ferrets and few people in pigs, in the hope that we have some relevance to the human condition. And maybe the relevance, I would argue, is that it's the circuitry underlying these responses to different sensory modalities that are in common.
So Siri and Helen can bring us now into registration with our favorite species. You've studied people who are infatuated.
Yeah, yes. But just to respond, one thing that Michael said about pair bonding and the fact that, the animals do it when they need to. And in fact, of 97% of mammals do not bother to pair up and form a pair bond. Only 3% do for long-term pair bonding, and it is because of particular ecological or sociological needs. And that's one of them. The babies don't run away. Among foxes, the mother's milk is too thin, so she's got to stay in the nest constantly with them, and she'll starve to death if somebody doesn't feed her. Among robins and bluebirds, it's the same thing. 90% of birds form pair bonds, and they do it largely because they do it because somebody's got to sit on those eggs, and that individual will starve to death. Things like swans and geese who form lifelong pair bonds apparently do it. I'm not too sure of this literature. Do it because they have so many babies so rapidly that nobody ever gets out of infancy before a new group comes in, so you're sort of stuck for life. But anyway, so I mean, I've done a lot of studies of human pair bonding, but what I did, just as a little bit of background, because you're talking about attraction and the sex drive and attachment, and I came to believe that we've evolved three overlapping but somewhat distinct brain systems for mating and reproduction. The sex drive being one, feelings of intense romantic love being the second, and feelings of deep attachment for an individual being the third. I don't think that they are phases. I think you can fall in love with somebody and then suddenly find them very sexually attractive. I think you can go to bed casually with somebody and that can actually trigger some of the brain circuitry for romantic love, and it'll go that way. And I think you can have a long, deep attachment to somebody from college or work or whatever, and then the circumstances are such that you suddenly fall in love with them. So we've got these three different brain systems, overlapping certainly, but distinct enough so that you can actually go to bed with somebody and have some sex drive and be absolutely positive that you are not in love with them, nor do you feel any deep attachment to them. So I've been more and more interested in how these three brain systems interact. I mean, you can feel deep attachment for one person while you feel intense romantic love for somebody else, while you feel the sex drive for a host of people. So I'm not positive we were built to be happy. We were built to reproduce, and at least the brain evolved to have a lot of different mechanisms for doing that. But anyway, what I and my colleagues have recently been studying over the last 10 years is the brain system associated with intense romantic love. And I've always felt that it was an extremely strong one, much stronger than the sex drive. You know, if you ask somebody to go to bed with you and they say no thank you, you don't kill yourself. But around the world, people live for love, they kill for love, they die for love, they sing about love, they write about love. The oldest love poetry comes from 4,000 years ago, the ancient Sumerians, myths and legends. As an anthropologist, almost every culture that we've ever studied where there's data has all kinds of myths and legends about intense romantic love. So in 1998, I came to think, this is an intense feeling. I think it evolved to enable you, I think the sex drive evolved to enable you to search for a whole lot of partners. I think romantic love evolved to enable you to focus your mating energy on just one at a time and start the mating process. And that attachment evolved to enable you to tolerate this human being, at least long enough to raise a child as a team. So I felt that nobody had ever studied any of the happy emotions. I'm not even positive romantic love is happy. It can be full of anxiety and fear and a whole host of emotions involved. So, but I thought that if I could put people in a functional MRI and somehow design an experiment I could perhaps find some of the networks in this system for romantic love.
So we do read about MRI in the newspaper, but if you could unbundle functional MRI.
Well, it looks like a long donut. It's a huge machine. You lie in it. It's a dark tube. It's open at both ends. It looks like a big giant donut. And you're lying in it. And we make our people very comfortable before we go in, because we don't want to measure anxiety in the brain. We've got to measure romantic love. It's a little hard when you've got your head in some clamps and in a cold room. So but that's a testament to how strong and powerful this feeling is. But anyway, we make people very comfortable. We put pillows under their knees. I interview them at great length to make sure that they're expensive, the machines, so you got to make sure you got somebody who's in love. The most important question that I ask them, the first question I asked them was, how long have you been in love? We've done 3 experiments. The first was among people who had just fallen in love, average period 7 months. And we had 17 people, 10 women and 7 men. And our second experiment, we put in people who had just been dumped. just been rejected in love. That was very difficult. I learned a lot from that one. It was difficult for me because these people are in intense physical and emotional pain, and love is an
How did you
addiction.
find these people?
It's pretty easy. It's amazing how,
Every college.
But they agreed.
not just college, In
They
fact,
agreed to participate in your experiments. I would have thought they'd be so depressed they'd want to just.
oh, those were, it's harder for the people who are really rejected.
Yeah.
But a lot of them think they might understand something about the experience that they're going through. So, and of course we say, well, you'll be helping science and you'll be making $50 and that kind of thing. Anything we can do.
Do you think they gain some understanding?
I hope they do. I explained to them about romantic love, and yes, I hope they do. I certainly learned some remarkable things from them, and I can be happy to go there. But so anyway, and the third experiment is we've just finished it, and we're going to announce it actually at the Society for Neuroscience in November. And we've put in 17 people who report that they're still in love after more than 15 years of marriage. The average number of years these people are married is 21 years. And the textbooks all maintain that you cannot sustain intense romantic love, and we found it in all of them. As a matter of fact, what we found in our last experiment is activity in part of the hypothalamus associated with the sex drive, in part of the ventral tegmental area associated with intense romantic love, and part of the ventral pallidum associated with attachment. All three brain systems are operating in these people who say that they are still in love in a long-term relationship. And but anyway, you asked about how we find the people. I would put big signs up in colleges and say, have you just fallen in love but can't let go? And they would stumble in. And some wouldn't call back. When I had to go to her dorm room and get her out of bed, she'd been in bed for 3 days.
And do you try to make equal numbers of men and women?
And we try, but not everybody wants to lie in a long dark hole with their head in a vice. Right. So we got, you have to be, I always say you can climb out of this. But so anyway, what the experiment is they bring in a photograph of their sweetheart, which I've carefully schooled them that we're not talking about the sex drive. This has to be a photograph that gives them that intense rush of elation. And I go through what romantic love is, all of the things. It's not a guessing game. This can't be a guessing game in this machine. I got to tell them what we're looking for. Do they have that? We need pictures that will drive this experience into them. And I go into great detail with them about what's going to go on, because if I need to measure romantic love, not anxiety, fear, curiosity, other kinds of things. The most important question that I ask them, the first question is, how long have you been in love? The most important question, I think, about romantic love, as opposed to the sex drive or attachment, is what percentage of the day and night do you think about your sweetheart? And they say, I never stop thinking about him. I wake up thinking about her. I go to bed thinking about him. There's somebody camping in my head. And so those are the ones we put in the machine. In the machine, we do three things. You bring in a photograph of your sweetheart, and you bring in a neutral photograph, a photograph of a person who calls forth no positive or negative reactions. And you look at the photograph of your sweetheart for 30 seconds. You lie in the machine. There's a mirror over your face. I put myself in 3 times before I put anybody else in. I thought it would be unethical not to. I happened to have been in love at the time. And and for my neutral, I used the doorman. I didn't tell him that. I said, "Can I take a picture of you?" He's a nice guy, but he doesn't do anything for me. So anyway, what happens?
Unusual doorman.
Yeah. So you look at a photograph of your sweetheart. for 30 seconds, and then you look at the neutral photograph for 30 seconds. The problem with that is that when you're really in love with somebody, you can't stop thinking about them. So I needed to have a distraction task. And so the one that I chose was a standard psychological one where you cast a large number on the screen, like 4,289. And you have to look at that number and just mentally, starting with that number, count backwards in increments of 7. And it actually drives all the blood to a little part of the parietal lobe. And at least for a while, you have a relatively still mind. And then you can, so basically the experiment was 12 minutes, although they were in there an hour because you got all these anatomicals to take. But anyway, if you look at your sweetheart, then you count back, then you look at the neutral, then you count back. So it's positive, count back, neutral, count back, positive, count back, da-da-da. And then what we do is we've got two controls now, the neutral and the count back, and we put all the scans of the person and then all the scans of all the people together, and we cancel out, we put them with the neutral scans, we cancel out what they have in common, probably the visual things, and leaving the brain in love. Mm-hmm. And what we found was activity in this reward system. And particularly the ventral tegmental area, a little factory near the base of the brain that actually produces dopamine and sends it to other brain regions. And also part of the caudate nucleus, which is a size of a medium-sized shrimp, really, on either side of the head. And basically what I learned from this was that romantic love is not an emotion. There's lots of emotions involved, and we did see activity in other parts of the brain associated with emotion. And we saw a lot of cortical activity. You're certainly thinking when you're in love. But the most powerful things that occur are in areas associated with drive, with wanting, with craving, with motivation, with focused attention, with elation. And that's what made me begin to realize that this was a basic mating system that evolved, uses many parts of the brain, but it's basically a drive. And I think it's a very powerfully basic drive, too. It can be more powerful than the drive to live. It's certainly more powerful, I think, than the sex drive under most circumstances. And it evolved for a very powerful reason, to start the mating process. And of course, as Darwin said, if you have 4 children and I have no children, you live on and I die out. So, the brain is really not necessarily built to win on Wall Street. It is built to reproduce.
Is it a residue of a more primitive drive? I mean, is it like a sublimated, almost like sublimation? Is it a form? Is it a residue of a biological drive that then takes the form in another form in this kind of ideational kind of conceptual?
I think the ideation is part of it. Basically, if one were to really reduce the brain to 3 very broad basic parts, you'd have the cognitive regions, you'd have the limbic areas associated with the emotions, and you'd have areas associated with drive. And I think, and quite clearly, all 3 basic, broad regions of the brain are involved, and I think that they can affect each other. Let's say you walk into a bar and somebody looks very attractive, and you suddenly feel beginning of the tingling of romantic love, and then you discover that they're a baby killer, or they murdered their mother, or I don't know, they're a sword swallower in the circus, and you say, I don't think so, I'm not going to fall in love with them, and so the cortical dampens the motivational, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they're all going to play with each other.
So the striatum that you so indelicately described is the size of a shrimp.
Yeah.
And by the way, I know certain neuroanatomists that would commit suicide if they heard.
Maybe I'm wrong.
So that's a motor control system, isn't it? In other words, it's known as a primary the caudate, a primary motor control system separate from the motor controls that come from the cerebral cortex.
But now they're thinking that it's more. Mm-hmm. If you spoke to Lucy Brown, that's what she would have come in, and she's the neuroscientist on our project. She would have said, that's been the standard thing, that it was only motor, and now we're finding all sorts of emotional and motivational responses associated with different parts of it.
So what about the people who have been rejected?
Oh, we found activity, and this hasn't been announced at all, we found activity in 4 regions associated with addiction. the nucleus accumbens, and parts of the cortex, which I don't remember. I could tell you as soon as I get home. And yeah, but big time activity in the nucleus accumbens in exactly the same regions associated with cocaine addiction. And when you think of it, romantic love is I think it's a very powerful addiction. I mean, a wonderful addiction when things are going well, and a perfectly horrible addiction when things are going poorly. But it's got all of the basic characteristics of addiction. You do inappropriate things. You delude yourself. You have to have more and more and more of the person. You have terrible withdrawals when things don't work out, and even relapse. I have a girlfriend who. It was about 8 months later. She had been rejected, and she was really suffering, and she was beginning to get over it. And she was driving along in her car, and she heard a song that reminded her of the man. And boom, the craving came back, the desire to drive by his house, to give him a call, to send a note, etc. So I think it's one of the most powerfully addictive substances on Earth. It's interesting. I mean, it has distinctions from other systems. And I think that the sooner we begin to realize that in the medical community and also in the educational community. For example, I had a student at Rutgers who just suddenly didn't show up for class for about 6 weeks. And I think most professors would say he was just lazy. And somebody came in and said, well, he's really suffering from rejection in love. And I realized this man can't get out of bed. It's worse than a broken leg for him.
Siri, are we making any sense? Does your apartment house in Oslo have a doorman? I mean, you treat patients for a living.
Yes,
and we've been talking about these basic neuroanatomical circuits wanting to be as relevant as possible. But how do you view all of this?
Yes, I have one sort of overall comment as concerns this interdisciplinary dialogue that you're inviting to and that I think is fascinating. And from my point of view, affects or sexuality or parenting behavior or what you like can be studied from multiple angles, from via animal models, via experimental studies done in my department and the neurocognitive scientific part of the department. So a concern, though, from my point of view, would be that we keep in mind that the studying sexuality or mating behavior from a hormonal point of view is just one angle, so that you don't make it the explanatory level. And I think this is, from my point of view, this is an important concern as concerns research funding, for instance. In my field, which is psychotherapy, treatment research, and so on, there is no such fascination with the brain. And we have got so much fascinating new technologies to study how the brain parts are enlightened in depression, and the pharmaceutical industry is heavily supporting this research because they think that when you finally locate the mechanisms that are wrong in depression or anxiety disorder or whatever, you will get the right drug to remediate all the right hormone. So that is a sort of bigger frame for my concern or listening to this dialogue, that we keep in mind the humility of the scientific enterprise that we're just representing one part of it. And I listened with interest to Michael's reasoning about parenting behavior. Of course, parenting behavior can be studied from hormonal level, and that's fascinating to listen to. And at the same time, as you point out, and from the clinician's point of view, of course, the main data are experience, and neuroscientific research cannot tell us anything about what the mind is experiencing, and experience is at the center of the psychotherapeutic dialogue. That's what I'm dealing with when I'm trying to help the patient. I had a patient who had this. I thought of your intervention, Helen, about this very well-known, from a clinical point of view, well-known conflicts between the attachment system and the sort of romantic desire system, as what Freud dealt with, the splitting of the tender side of the sexual life and the more sexual desire level. And this patient of mine who said, I adore my wife, we had 2 great, wonderful children, just I'm not attracted to her anymore, I can't have sex with her. And all night he was surfing on the internet looking for sort of pornographic films. In that case, it was this sort of this level of unconscious fantasizing imagination that was tied to specific sort of qualities of object relating, which in my thinking is related to early experience. And now tying in with that reasoning, that I think what's really fascinating on a more explanatory level of today is the interaction. Right. And we know that now, the research of Erik Kandel, for instance, who has demonstrated that deficient attachment in early age really is expressed as deficiency in the brain. So we are faced with the question, what comes first? And okay, it's a hormonal, sort of, we can register hormonal deficits, but in the therapeutic room you will address these patients longing for the gleam in the mother's eye that he never got, the longing for the being held, the quality of skin. Yeah. So, yeah, that would be. But I just wanted to comment on your finding that you find that people may stay in love. And that's, I agree with you, it's contrary to most of our literature, which, especially the psychoanalytic one, which sort of focus on this conflict between safety, familiarity, on the one hand, attachment, and desire, passion, sexual excitement on the other. You can sort of, and I from both my sort of clinical experience and also my personal thinking about this, I agree with you that it's challenging to try to conceptualize what is it that make couples function to make love last. And in my experience from the clinical field, the question of sort of being able to integrate your fantasies, forbidden.
Integrate your what? Integrate
your fantasies. You're more your forbidden fantasy. You feel ashamed. Sexuality is maybe the most forceful, pleasurable force in us. The New York psychoanalyst Rothstein has talked about excess. It's something that shakes us in a way. It transcends our familiar ways of being. So we are much more different when we are sexual than we are used to think about. It's a huge, experientially, it's something very forceful in us, and that makes us shameful often to expose that, being denuded in the sexual interaction. We're exposed to the gaze of the other, and here attachment comes in, because safety, when you feel safe enough to sort of dare to expose your desires and to say, this is what I want, in a way. I just had a recent research in Norway, Norwegian sexological research, demonstrating that couples that have the most frequent sex life and so on are also the couples that communicate most, being able to open up to say, you know, I want it this way, or yeah. So there is so my comment to these sort of long-lasting, happy couples would be that I think that there is a more safety enough to be open towards yourself, your own sort of wild or irrational or forbidden or perverse fantasies.
Can I respond to this?
Yeah.
Because I've just put my next book to bed, which is Why You Fall in Love with One Person Rather Than Another. And but in that I had read about, there's a lot of studies of why American scientists want to know about the psychological and economic and sociological forces that hold a couple together. And there was a recent meta-analysis of 470 studies, and they have found no personality traits that but wait till you, because you're on the right track. There's many reasons that we fall in love with one person rather than another, and we stay with them because we're the same socioeconomic background, same general level of intelligence, same general level of good looks, same religious values, etc. There's all kinds of sociological reasons that we might stay together, but there's no data that shows that any particular personality traits combine to sustain long-term love. And the only thing that they have actually found that does seem to sustain it is what they call positive illusions. And if you just sustain your belief in spite of all reality that she is young, beautiful, smart, loving, all of that, those are the ones that stay together.
I guess that's what transparency is.
I read a study recently that's relevant to some of this, and I just briefly read it before I came here. This was a study done on human males that were in long-term relationships with their partners. Some of the men were married, and some were just living and not married with their partners. And they gave these men, I guess, a bonding scale to see how strong they felt their relationship was with the woman they were with, and also the likelihood that they had marital or at least pair crises where they might even consider divorcing or separating. And they also did some genetic analysis, and they found that there was this polymorphism, which just means different types of genes. And they wanted to know if one of these types, the individuals that had poor bonding, so they were still with, they didn't leave the woman, but whether these individuals that had poor bonding, did they have a different gene type than the people who felt more secure in their relationships? And what they found, and this is kind of interesting and related to the ventral pallidum.
Yeah, I know the study.
You know the study.
Yeah.
They found that there was this difference in what's called the vasopressin receptor gene. There's different kinds of vasopressin receptor genes which ultimately affect how the vasopressin receptor is produced. The ventral pallidum is, at least in lower organisms, I'm assuming in humans as well, but I'm not sure.
The study was in humans.
The ventral pallidum is loaded with this vasopressin receptor. There's a researcher at Emory University, Larry Young, who in voles, which is a rodent, he says that vasopressin in the ventral pallidum is important for pair bonding. And they found that people who were less pair bonded had one kind of vasopressin receptor gene. Right. And the receptor affects whether that structure can be affected by vasopressin. And the last thing to note is vasopressin is very similar to oxytocin. Some people think that oxytocin works either in the caudate or the nucleus accumbens, right, while vasopressin is acting in the ventral pallidum. So there is this kind of, certainly experience is important, but genes are important. Experience can change the brain. Genes can be turned on and off by experience, but then also the basic genes you have can affect the way the brain is constructed, and the hormones can interact with all of that to change the brain. So,
but what you said earlier, though, in terms of the experiment, where if the mother doesn't take care of the child, and then the child goes on in life, then the child doesn't take care of the child.
Right.
But that is not genetic, you said.
That's not, right.
So that in that situation, you have a behavior that looks very much, unless in the research you are talking about, the vasopressin effect was changed because of early experience.
Well, let's kind of make this more integrative, because don't forget, you get these mothers that are just shown being less attentive. But let's kind of say, well, what would happen when a mother would really abandon her babies or neglect her babies or abuse her babies? And so therefore you have to say this is one piece of a puzzle. But you can argue, one, that experience is important, but you can also argue that genes are important. And there's something called gene-environment interaction, that if you have a certain genetic makeup and then you're exposed to some kind of experience, the effect of the two together might be worse than the effect of either one or the other.
So the question is, could the experience override the genetics?
And I think that...
But there's a whole new area of
can.
investigation called epigenetics,
Right.
which imply where you have experience actually changes genetic structure in individuals,
Yeah.
which is not an inherited kind of
Right.
effect, but an
Right.
effective experience on the expression. For example, Francis Chapin has looked at the estrogen receptor alpha and shown that animals that are derived from high licking and grooming moms are more likely to express that gene, apparently as a result. No one knows the mechanism whereby you get from the experience to that change in gene expression, but she at least has shown the change in gene expression. So there's another level of analysis that comes into this. Yeah.
Do you mean activation when you say change?
In this case, the gene is turned on more avidly in individuals that have had that particular kind of early experience. Well, Don knows more about this than I do.
Methylation would be a chemical change that will usually suppress a gene. And an acetylation of the proteins that cover the DNA would ordinarily be associated with an activation.
Sorry, go ahead.
There's just like there's studies of neglected children which have disturbances in the oxytocin and vasopressin system, so that like the lack of maternal attention means that they won't. It's just like those rats that are.
Maybe we should set up for
May I
questions.
just ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
In the person you talked about who stayed in bed for 3 weeks or 6 weeks, clinically my experience has been that when you have someone who has a very hard time getting over the breakup of a romantic situation, what makes the giving up difficult is that they are furious.
Right.
And they don't know what to do with that fury because they're helpless, stuck with this fury in them.
Yeah.
And that's what I have found clinically. I don't know if
Let me tell you what, I mean, this is one of the things that I learned. I was putting these people who were rejected in the machine, and and one of them was, she was a perfectly nice person, and before I put her in the machine. But when she came out of that machine, she was furious. And she dashed out of the lab, and she didn't collect her money. And about 20 minutes later, she came back in, and I took her into another part of the hospital, and we sat down, and she started to rage at me. And I suddenly realized she's not mad at Helen Fisher. She is furious at this man. And I triggered it in her brain.
And I found that when you can help the person with dealing with that anger, they give up the love. The romantic love. That in fact it is the rage that's holding them to that romantic love rather than love.
Maybe there's a microphone. Do you want the questions amplified?
They should go to the microphone.
Okay.
Anyone would like to have a question, go to that particular microphone.
While we're setting up, yes, please, come. We talked about pheromones and olfaction. We've talked about sex, and it just occurred to me that I had a finding that related them. We discovered that the nerve cells, the GnRH nerve cells that govern all of mammalian reproduction, actually start out in the nose, and they migrate up the nose, they migrate along the bottom of the brain, they hang a left into the hypothalamus. So I had to give a fundraising talk at Rockefeller to a bunch of bequest lawyers. And they all have a couple drinks, and then they come listen to us, and then they have dinner. So I was going down to the men's room, and I came back up, and this bequest lawyer who'd had a couple drinks looked at me, and he said, "You just gave a talk, right?" And I said, "Right." And he said it was about those sex cells that start out in the nose and go to the brain, right? And I said, "Right." And his face brightened. And he said, "Now I realize why, when my wife had a nose job, she lost her interest in sex." So, we scientists communicate in many ways. Please.
Please say who you are.
Okay, Penny Ellen Burkles, just a student here and there. of psychology, neuroscience, and I want to mention a couple of thoughts about the studies. First I want to say that this is wonderful, and thank you for presenting this and being here. With regard to the emotions, it would stand to reason that there is probably a strong relationship in both the anxiety and the intensity of the romantic attachment. I say a high correlation between that and the levels of sex hormones in men and women. So if anybody has not measured that or developed an intensity of attachment scale, a romantic attachment scale, that would be something. And I'm more fascinated by the rejection of animals. The polar bear, the panda, who were in the news recently, of their offspring, where a mother just totally rejected them. Somewhere on AOL, there was a picture of a little tiger cub that was being reared by and suckled by a dog of some breed. And I'm wondering there if they find any distinctions, if there are enough of them in a sample to look at them physiologically, but also whether or not these animals in a zoo might have been artificially inseminated as opposed to being able to naturally mate.
Right.
So that's,
I mean, that would be interesting to know how would the animals produced and what kind of maternal care did they have. But also, being in a zoo is probably a very stressful, unnatural situation. You're expecting the normal development of a behavior in a very high stress environment. And so even that, just like we said, Harlow's monkeys, when they had high anxiety, wouldn't care for their babies. It could be that these are just they could never even initiate the bonding. Possibility.
And just responding to the first part of your question, there's all kinds of reactions between these systems. For example, in many brain regions, elevated activity of dopamine can drive up testosterone. And so you fall in love with somebody, presumably amping up the dopamine system, and you suddenly find them very sexually attractive. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because of that positive interaction between the two systems. And with orgasm, there's a real flood of oxytocin and vasopressin. And this is why casual sex is never casual, because you're triggering these brain systems. And in fact, I've often thought as an anthropologist that there's, that men and women will often have, two different types of reproductive strategies. Either taking them to bed right off the bat and see if you can't trigger those brain systems in them, or her, and get spend several months getting to know somebody and try and trigger it cognitively, and then go on to it. I have a student who is studying hooking up, and I think he's got a sample now of about 300 and something, and he says that 50% of women who've had a one-night stand and 52% of men report that they initiated it to create a longer-term relationship, and a very high percentage of them get really depressed when they don't get into a longer relationship, and 1/3 of his hookups did turn into a longer relationship.
all right, so you don't think that the intention would just to go out and try to find one sort or another of mate, either long-term or short-term, would not be related to, say, a decrease in the level of testosterone or estrogen due to aging?
Oh, that's an idea.
And that the anxiety would not be as intense, or would it be social learning that, I've had so much rejection and I know that this and this doesn't work out this way because I'm older and wiser, or just the fact that, hey, I've hit menopause and now I love fMRI studies more than I could possibly love another.
All of the above I would go for.
I'm sure there are other questions, but with respect to the first part of your question, hormone-behavior relations in humans, and Michael will correct me, among men, I think that these are mainly recognized around the extremes. In other words, it's the eunuch, the guy with no testosterone at all, that's allowed to take care of the harem, and it's the guy that's taking high levels of testosterone who's likely to be violent and show masculine traits. And in the middle, I don't think the correlations are all that great.
I agree with you.
What do you think, Mike?
I agree completely. I mean, I think moment-to-moment variations in testosterone certainly have been documented in people who are in long-term relationships, short-term relationships, but I don't think there's very good data that illustrate a link between those moment-to-moment changes in testosterone and some change in motivation. Testosterone, well, there's some debate about this even in animal studies. There are some people that claim that you can get, say, within 20 minutes, you can get very rapid effects of changes in testosterone or estradiol. But generally speaking, these hormones take more time to act. They're transcription factors that provoke a whole cascade of gene events that take time. And they're often more structural, probably, than, although Don's earliest, you with estradiol, you've shown early on, 30 years ago, that estradiol can change electrical activity very quickly in the rat nervous system. So,
But that's rats.
yeah, it's rats. Right, and I don't know if there's any kind of analogy in the primate literature or not.
And with women, it's more complicated because as ovarian hormones decline with age, that you then have hormones coming from the adrenal gland, probably androgens, testosterone in greater amounts. And then endocrinologists, like all of us here, will argue about whether in women androgens are just as important to drive on libido as estrogens. There was a guy named Richard Michael who pushed that idea, the androgens, but a current expert is Kim Wallen at Emory University in Atlanta, and he thinks that estrogens, perhaps coming from the adrenal glands, are just as important.
Thank you.
Sandra has a question.
Yes. Sorry. One quick thing.
Who are you?
Oh, I'm Maya Solovitz. I'm a science journalist. I wanted to ask, you had mentioned addiction in relation to love, and it seems more like it should be, you have it backwards, that addiction is like love. Love is not like addiction, because we didn't evolve to become drug addicts. We evolved to fall in love. And so I think a lot of times when people talk about this, they get that backwards, and they think that, like, the love is taking over the drug area of the brain, and it kind of creates a sort of false impression about that. And my actual question is, now that we seem to have human equivalents of mountain voles and prairie voles with and the mountain voles are not monogamous and the prairie voles are not promiscuous, I finally remember that, but now that we have this, it seems like it may be possible to develop a drug to make people monogamous, potentially, if you could, or maybe a brain region that you can't get to the dopamine by that. But how is this going to affect us socially when, if we, am I going to, gene test my man to see if he's a, straying man, or, what kind of implications will this research have? I'd love to hear what you guys think.
It's all yours.
Well, I'm sure we all have a thing. I don't think it's going to have the impact everybody else does. I think that the more we understand biology, the more we're going to really understand the impact of culture and experience and learning, all this new stuff on epigenetics. We haven't put together the pathways of how those things work, but they're there. And I mean, for example, let's say you find out that you are biologically susceptible to alcoholism, and you choose to not drink. Let's say you say you're biologically susceptible to drug addiction or gambling or something else, and you choose to alter your life in another way. I'm not threatened by understanding the biology of behavior, because I think that the cultural component is so profound, and they work together so dramatically. And as we move forward, we'll see those ways that they change. And we know that a certain amount of therapy works,
I was meaning more about discrimination against such people, and
oh, I see.
The impact that it would have on just how you make the decisions about who you want to try to love, or
I think if you can, I don't think you need to put somebody in a machine to know whether they love you. I think you can make it pretty clear over dinner, just by talking to them.
Hiroaki has a point.
I want to comment on the genetic testing predicting the phenotype. So when you talk about genes, people may think about classic Mendelian genetics. If you have gene X, you predict the outcome would be Y. But all these things we're talking about, the gene influence the behavior, is not like that. It's affecting, and it's statistically significant but it's not predictive at all. So that means that if you genotype your significant others and find a variation, particular variation of vasopressin, I don't have I don't know the actual number, but it's more like your boyfriend or a husband is 5% more likely to have extra affair. So is that significant? Is that something that will determine your choice whether you want him together or not?
Right. Well,
So
presumably, you probably already know if your boyfriend is likely to be a cheating bastard by his past history.
Well, doesn't seem to stop you.
No. Reality.
Building on what Hiroaki said before the next question, I can give the following oil painting. That if you're on a sensory surface and you have a gene disrupted in an olfactory sensory neuron, then chances are you'll have a detectable loss of sensing the odor that neuron did. If you lose the gene that allows you to have sweet taste very rapidly, you'll notice that genetic effect. But for most of the complicated behaviors and syndromes that all of us scientists and citizens are interested in, what we normally have is what they call multigenic syndromes, which means large numbers of genes, each of which makes a very small % contribution to the overall behavior. And so, for example, with schizophrenia, clearly there are genetic patterns that lead to schizophrenia, but it's probably more than 20 to 30 genes that are contributing. So we're fighting it out in the hedgerows. There's no simple answers. Yes.
I just wanted to have a comment on the concept of choice. You said the genetic or whatever disposition, and then you could choose not to drink or not to. And I think the psychology in that choice concept is very important. And I just sort of wanted to say that when we speak of love, and we speak of it in this panel, I think we tend to focus very much on the object, on what are the qualities of the object, smell sort of makes us being attracted, and we focus less on what I would call the sort of capacity to love, which is a maturational product, I think, and I would formulate it as sort of the capacity to also be curious about and interesting in the other as an other, not only confirming me in this or that way, or sort of, and that's the question of human maturation. I deal with the concept of maturity, the mature personality. So I just wanted to bring that into this genetic dialogue.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm Elaine Baruch, and listening to all these wonderful comments, I thought of a whole lot of other things I want to say, but I better control myself. But just one thing, the idea of maturation, in addition to the question I want to raise, in addition to maturation, or rather with reference to maturation, of the concept of thinking of the other as an other and not just as an object, isn't this a relatively new concept with regard to women? It seems to me that in previous centuries, even generations, that the woman was usually considered an object and that it was only the male that was considered a subject. But that was not my reason for getting up here. However, it's something I'd like to hear you comment on. As an anthropologist, I was surprised to hear you say that, or I assumed from what you were saying, that romantic love is universal, that it occurs in all cultures and at all times. And I'm glad to hear it, but it certainly goes against everything I've ever read. It was my understanding that romantic love was a phenomenon that was born in the 12th century in the south of France, the courtly love poets, partly a little bit of influence perhaps from the Arab poets, and very little else before that. Maybe a little bit in the Song of Songs, certainly one doesn't find it in polygamous societies.
Yes, one does.
You know?
Absolutely, one does.
Okay.
Yeah, you find it everywhere. There's been very nice studies of that, and I'm glad you brought it up because
Okay,
it's a
glad
real
you
pet
too.
peeve of mine.
I'm sorry?
It's a pet peeve of mine to think that this is only a Western thing that evolved in the 12th century is something that really, it really gets me, because to think that the Iraqis don't love, or that the Australian Aborigines don't love, or blah, blah, blah. Anyway, long and short is that a guy called Bill Jankowiak wrote originally about this, and he looked at 168 societies. He's now gotten a lot more societies. Every single place where anthropologists have actually collected data, they found data. They found evidence of it. Myths, legends. They go up and tell the anthropologist about it. Suicides, homicides, or behavior patterns that are associated with romantic love. Everywhere in the world.
As I say, I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
So the homicides would be like guys fighting over a woman, or
Yeah.
women fighting over a guy?
Yeah.
You know.
But the first thing I wanted to just answer that other part too, about women being objects.
Yes.
For millions of years we traveled in these little hunting and gathering groups, and when you take a look at the extant hunting and gathering societies, there's not many today, but there's been a good deal of data collected on them, and in hunting and gathering societies, women tend to be extremely powerful. They go out gathering every day. They commute to work. They gather 60 to 80% of the evening meal. They come home with dinner. 1 out of 4 times when a man goes hunting, he comes back with something to eat. I've traveled a little bit with the Hunting and Gathering Society myself, and in Africa, and in those societies where women are economically powerful, they're also sexually powerful and socially powerful. Women have lost a lot of their power in agrarian societies. Men's roles became extremely important, moving the rocks, felling the trees, plowing the land, taking the produce off to local markets, coming home with the equivalent of money. But as we move, when you take a look at the agrarian, women have always had a lot of informal power.
Yes,
but,
I would say emotional power.
Yeah.
I would completely agree on that. I think feminist has been too reductionist on that. They haven't sort of. If you look into the clinicians' room, you see the power of women, the power of mothers. I mean, that's under communicated issue within feminism, I think.
Oh, I agree with Charlie. It was a question of romantic love rather than power in different relationships. So I was particularly interested in. I found your answer to that.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the place of grooming and play in this, because, for example, if you want to talk about other than humans, we would find both of those. We can have cross species there. Grooming is present in many species. Play is present. Play strikes me as an exploratory activity. You spoke about maturation, but in this sense, this could be very early, or rooted on other levels other than, what happens through further experience. It might have a base there. In other words, has anybody studied this, the variations in exploratory behavior? We know that some children will stay very close to mothers and others will walk further and further away, and there are differences. And then the same thing with grooming, which is a nesting behavior, very opposite to play, where security, I think, or safety is paramount. So you come back to that whole discussion we had about sexuality and monogamy, staying close to home and going away from home, etc. It seems to me somebody might have developed these in terms of the question of the interaction, both on a genetic or a level like that and a behavioral level as well, and what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main contributions from attachment theory and the research in that tradition. They sort of pointed out forcefully and through experimental situation called the strange situation, the connection between the sort of safety system and the attachment system and the exploratory system. And so if you're safe, you have the freedom to explore. If you're not safe in the relationship, you sort of check the caregiver all the time, so there's no freedom to sort of go out into the world to play or to explore. And there is a substantial research tradition in developmental psychology demonstrating the links between sort of safety in attachment and a lot of exploratory play behavior, social interaction, speech. So I think that's been strongly demonstrated, and the importance of play in development is part of that research tradition also. So,
is this a subject that brings your thinking and research from Bowlby right on to what you're saying now in amazingly close connection to the kind of thing that Michael talks about with taking care of animal babies and the question of exploring away from the nest and the high licking and grooming mothers? It sounds very similar to me.
Well, there are examples in a monkey called the vervet monkey, where some mothers are very protective and other mothers are less protective, and they let their babies wander away. So once monkeys get old enough, they can wander away and they come back. And so there is this kind of personality difference in the monkeys, and the mothers that are protective tend to be also more fearful. So this is a little bit different than the rats. So the mothers that are more protective tend to be more fearful, but so they never let the baby explore. Every time the baby moves away, they pull the baby back, and then that baby ends up growing up being a more protective mother and also more fearful. So I really do think, now the question, of course, because they haven't done cross-fostering studies, you don't know how much of it is a genetically regulated temperament and how much of it is the result of the experience of the way your mother treated you, but I'm assuming it's based on the rat work that it's going to be related to the way the mother treated her. And the woman, Fairbanks, who studied this, she thinks it's an experiential effect. But clearly that's what Bowlby would say, that this whole relationship between an infant and its mother has such ramifications for the development of social behavior generally and fearfulness, and so exploration, but it's also related to confidence versus shyness and timidity, and that has so much ramifications to how we interact in our whole social world. Now, these high grooming mothers, they're in the nest licking and grooming, but the contact time isn't any different. Yeah. So they're in the nest with the babies as much as the low licking and grooming. They just pay more attention to the babies. It just so happens, for other reasons maybe, that the high licking and grooming offspring grow up to be less fearful. And that's not really related in this context to exploration. And also high licking grooming, they get these changes in their brains. I did want to kind of, if you can hold off for a second, just go back to another question in terms of why are we studying the genetics? Do we want to do interventions? And what Michael Baum was indicating about epigenetics, and which I think is really important, that we want to know the whole shebang. We want to know all the details of how a system works so that how a system can go awry. And then we could say, okay, given that we know how it works and how it can get screwed up, where could we intervene? In other words, there are some ways in which we're going to be able to intervene to prevent, let's say, child abuse, child neglect, impulsive behavior, aggression, violence, sexual predators. And in other cases, we're not going to be able to intervene. And I think the bottom line is the more we understand about this interaction between early experience, but even later experience. So the idea is that it's not just the early relationships. Even Harry Harlow showed you can take the baby away from a mother, but if you raise the baby with peers, that can take away some of the negative effects of not having a mother. That there are a lot of avenues, even through later life, and that's why psychotherapy is probably important, that you can get in there and you can change the brain. That's what learning is. Yeah. Learning changes the brain, and one of the ways it does it is by modifying where the genes get expressed. And so, for example, to say, well, what's this thing with hormones? Well, what happens if a particular learning experience affects a gene that gets expressed, and now you can be responsive to a hormone? All the stuff can be interlinked together, and we want to know how all the pieces fit together.
Right. My question piggybacks on yours, though I feel compelled to tell you that Harlow was an alcoholic, and that his studies on the wire monkeys were part of his own interest in his inability to relate to people, because he stayed up and late at night drinking while he was doing those experiments. So that might
it's
help.
well known that he was an alcoholic.
Well, something good can come out of it.
I found myself thinking about 5 patients, 3 men and 2 women who can't love.
Who can't what?
Who can't love. And then I found myself wondering if we could put those kinds of people in the MRI machines and take pictures of their brain and see that where they don't have responses. Because while we're talking about the capacity to love, many of our patients come to us with an incapacity to love.
Is this attachment, romantic love, or?
Romantic love and attachment.
And attachment, okay.
And some have prided themselves. One of them is married and has had children but doesn't have intercourse, and his 2 children were born by artificial insemination. So that while you're all talking about that, I was wondering about the negative side of it, of putting the people who can't love, and that would show light on the people who can love.
It's a good idea.
My name is Joel Kanaz. I actually have a question for Dr. Fisher. You in your essay on how essentially antidepressants can screw up the mating strategies, you're dealing mostly with females. Do you also how do you feel that also works with males, and how that, and obviously there's the difference between the romantic, the front end part of the mating strategy, and then the attachment, and what does one do about that?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought it up. This is my real pet peeve. I get all my pet peeves today here. This is really important to me. I have not studied women or men. I haven't studied anybody. But I wrote a paper on this that was published, and since then I've had a second thing. Long and short of it is, having studied the brain in love, romantic love, and seen the dopamine system really become activated, and all of the textbooks say that activity in certain parts of the dopamine system, elevated activity, suppress the serotonin system. So that seems to be a relatively well-known relationship. When you take SSRIs, you're driving up the serotonin system. And it's well known in the textbooks that when you drive up the serotonin in these particular brain regions, you're suppressing the dopamine system. So that's given. So I then said, we got 100 million, apparently, people in America taking antidepressants. These have gone generic. Now, they're not all SSRIs, but a lot of them are. And they've gone generic, so they're around the world. And we know they blunt the emotions. That's in every piece of the literature. We know that they try to suppress obsessive thinking. The main characteristic of romantic love is obsessive thinking. And the textbooks say that as you drive up the serotonin, you are suppressing the dopamine system. So it occurred to me, and to a psychiatrist, Andy Thompson, we wrote the piece together, that these people who are taking SSRIs are jeopardizing their ability to fall in love and stay in love. I'm not saying that there's some people who naturally their serotonin system needs a kick. It's so low that it needs to get up high enough to even begin to create the right kinds of social. I'm not talking about the people who, but there's an awful lot of people who take these drugs because they're doing poorly in school or getting through a depression, and then they keep taking them with these, and then they wonder why it is that they can't feel romantic love. And I probably get an email once a week from somebody saying to me, this is a characteristic one I got a few months ago. It was from a man, and he said, you know, I was madly in love with my girlfriend, and I was doing poorly in school. They put me on an SSRI. I very quickly realized I wasn't interested in sex with her, but I also didn't love her anymore. And so I moved out. And 7 months later, he apparently got off the drugs, and he suddenly, not only did his sex drive come back, but his feelings of intense romantic love for this woman came back. So he walked in, I think it was in Holland, went into a florist, and he bought all the roses he could carry in his arms, and he went over to her house, and he said, I think I made a terrible mistake. Would you take me back? Which she did. And then he wrote to me, could it be the drugs? And I get a letter once a week from somebody saying, and for some reason, the modern medical community, they treat one system without understanding that when you treat one system, you are going to affect related systems. And I call it the numbing of America.
This was in Holland.
Yeah, I know, the numbing of the world.
The numbing of the world.
Yeah.
So that's specifically SSRIs. I mean, there are other things, that for treatment of depression, exercise, diet.
Exactly.
Is that the same thing?
Well, I'm not in the medical community, and I think there are some people who are getting over a really dramatically bad love affair, or their husband died in a plane crash, or some kind of something where they honestly need real strong drugs. But certainly exercise drives up dopamine. Being with good friends, oxytocin is associated with touch, and there's other ways to go, and it's going to depend on the situation.
People talk about caloric restriction as having an antidepressant effect. The mechanism there is probably that when the part of the hypothalamus that senses whether you have enough food tells you that you don't have enough food, there are projections directly over to a nerve cell group that expresses a gene called orexin, also called hypocretin, and that neuron type, the orexin hypocretin neuron, definitely wakes up the animal. If you have mutations in that orexin gene, you may be subject to narcolepsy. Whereas if your orexin neurons are performing at a high level, you're likely to be running around looking for food, and so that would be the activating effect that would be antidepressant. But sometimes we talk as though each of these, everybody will hate me, but these transmitters and peptides as counters, almost like pieces in a chess game. I've got my knight out there and my rook out there and a couple of pawns, and that makes me a less depressed person. I just have to remind you that dopamine, which is a very simple chemical, has 5 different kinds of receptors. And receptor 1 and receptor 5 behave very similarly to each other, 2, 3, and 4 similarly, but they're not identical. Serotonin, there are 14 genes coding for serotonin receptors, and some of them heighten serotonergic activity and others decrease serotonergic activity. We've talked about oxytocin and vasopressin, both small pieces of proteins that have 9 amino acids and came from a parent protein a long time ago. They're so-called gene duplication products. Okay, so we talk about oxytocin as the hormone of love and affiliation, vasopressin often associated with aggression by a man named Gert de Vries at the University of Massachusetts. But oxytocin, vasopressin binds to the oxytocin receptor with the same affinity as oxytocin does. And oxytocin can be seen as sometimes working through the vasopressin receptor. So you don't have to worry about the complexity of human behavior being brought down to the numbers of pieces in a chess set, let's say the number of transmitters and peptides that we happen to have identified. These subtleties that I'm telling you about make for the richness even of the behavior of lower rodents, not to speak of primates and humans.
What about testosterone?
Well,
my brother-in-law told me, I went down to Florida, and my brother-in-law said, you got to get this stuff. He said, it's great. First of all, I'm just feeling great. Secondly, my penis has grown. And I immediately went to 12 stores to try to find it. Then I asked him, and he said to me, man, not a good idea to take.
Actually, Bobby Bonds had already used it all up. Maybe, would you like to speak to questions about testosterone and human behavior? Or would you like to talk about circumstances under which we can derive implications from animal behavior to human behavior, and other circumstances where we can't?
Right. Well, testosterone, is a widely abused compound in athletes, as we know. There's been huge press about it, and the abuse is reflected in behavioral changes. It's reflected in liver damage. It's not a compound you want to use without close medical supervision.
Don't your balls shrink? I mean, from
Yes.
testosterone,
Yes,
yeah.
testosterone
Yeah.
The excess testosterone that you take, if you're that kind of athlete, will go to the brain and will turn off the brain hormone that tells the pituitary to turn on the testes, and therefore...
Oh, your balls shrink. Is that what you said? I missed... I thought you were talking about my head. Yes, your testes, as Don is saying here, will shrink, and your spermatogenesis will be disrupted ultimately.
And some effect on prostate.
Prostate can be stimulated. There are all sorts of nasty acne, all sorts of nasty reasons for excessive amounts of these anabolics.
I'm not doing it.
It's not a good. I mean, if you have a big deficiency and you're hypogonadal, then it can save your life and in a psychological sense. I mean, there are men, for example, where the GnRH neurons don't migrate into location, Kalman syndrome, where men never go through puberty. And you then now have puberty if you take testosterone for a lifetime, and it's a great therapeutic advance. But for the average guy, it's not a good idea. In regard to Don's, I mean, we who work with animals get our support from the NIH and other federal agencies, and we are doing work that we think is translational often, in the sense that's the buzzword at NIH these days, that it's providing information. Dr. Matsunami is doing the same thing, and Mike Numan as well. It's providing information that you can translate in terms of mechanisms from the mouse or the rat to the human being. And in the context of behavior, there's a lot of debate about how relevant are our studies where we look at, Don looks at lordosis behavior and spent a lifetime studying the details of female sexual behavior and the way that hormones act in different specific parts of the brain with different genes being affected in the most elaborate way, explaining how lordosis is generated in a female rodent, in a rat or a mouse. But can we translate that now to the regulation of female reproductive behavior? Probably not at this point.
It's not a public health problem.
Well, but there are issues of female sexual motivation, for example, but there's a lot of debate about, in the context of Frank Beach, who's the father of behavioral endocrinology, talked about the effect of the cerebral cortex taking the role of what had been previously the hypothalamic regulation of these behaviors, this feminine sexual behavior in particular, and also male sexual behavior to perhaps a slightly lesser extent. And the role of hormones in the adult, we as primates have been liberated, thankfully perhaps, from direct, hardwired hormonal control of reproductive behaviors. That's not to say that hormones have no role to play, but they're not as dramatic and as determinate in us as they are in rodents, or even in pigs, or in ferrets, or even maybe in some non-human primates like rhesus monkeys. So we have to be careful when we make these arguments about translation. But I think there's also a lot of ignorance about how human behavior is being controlled, both in terms of the psychological context, but also in terms of the mechanistic neurotransmitter, hormonal circuitry in the brain. We still have a lot to learn. And the more we know in the long run, I think the better off we're going to be. So we argue, those of us who do research on animals, that our work is not always immediately translational, and sometimes is suspiciously untranslational, but we're optimists. And in the long run, we have some examples of types of, for example, I'll give one example. The androgen receptor, we're talking about testosterone. The androgen receptor is the protein in target cells in the nervous system or in the prostate gland that enable testosterone to actually change gene transcription in that target neuron. The androgen receptor has been shown to be spontaneously mutated in just about every mammalian species that we've studied, including man. So there is a syndrome called congenital androgen insensitivity, in which case you have a genetic XY male who has testes, who produces testosterone, who has a mutation in the androgen receptor, And as a result, these people develop externally as they look like women because they don't have male genitals, because the male genitalia are all totally determined by the activation of androgen receptors during development. These people live as women. They're raised as girls. They look like girls externally. They're extremely successful, even though they, at the age of puberty, their testes start producing testosterone, which gets aromatized, converted to estrogens. Typically, that's often the case prior to the advent of genotyping. You would have these people who look like women who are XY individuals, and now they tend to be detected more early in life. But even now, there are people that are at the age of 14 who are first detected as being androgen-insensitive individual. These individuals are amazingly successful psychologically as women. They have sex drives. They're given, when they're castrated, then they're given hormone replacement, estrogen and progesterone, another really important therapy, use of steroid hormones clinically, that's appropriate and very successful. These women have normal parental, they can adopt children. They can't themselves become pregnant because they don't have ovaries, but they can adopt children and rear them and have normal, very loving relationships with children. They have sex lives. They're typically almost always heterosexual. They have men as their partners, even though they themselves are XY, and in a sense, they are male in that sense, even though we would call them women because phenotypically they are appearing on the outside, at least, as women, and they behave as women. And that is an example, I think, of a phenomena we're now starting to look at in animal models. We have a spontaneous TFM mouse model, which has been studied very extensively now in the last 10 years by various people. Now the androgen receptor has been experimentally knocked out using modern genetic techniques. And again, the behaviors of mice in which that gene has been knocked out are very revealing and have, especially as we start to look at odor, for example, odor preferences in these animals. Male typical odor preference for female odors turns out to be an androgen receptor mediated event. So TFM mice look very much like females in that regard. And this particular enterprise has been translated, I think, most successfully to the human case because we have this beautiful human syndrome, the congenital androgen-insensitive syndrome that we can study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
before we end, I know where everybody's. I just hope that we can hear a little bit more from Dr. Gullestad and Dr. Nersessian on their views, if they have anything that they want to say to wrap up, or any comments on sex and love. We'd love to hear from you. We've heard from the other scientists.
I didn't hear the first part of the question. You wanted the
general reflections on human love.
And sex and love.
That's good.
They're both good.
To me, we're closing?
Oh,
no.
We have a question here. Could we get a result of the smell test by a show of hands?
Well, wait,
Oh, yes, let's do that.
why don't we do that and then have Siri give us a final reflection from a psychoanalytic point of view?
Okay, so you have a minute to think. All those who smelt, raise your hand.
Also, my book.
Okay.
So that, which is the one? Whether
Who could smell? Who could smell?
And it was a bad smell.
All right. So,
Are we?
okay. So who
apparently
thought it's disgusting? Who thought it's disgusting?
Well, I thought it was medicinal.
Okay. Who thought it's?
Also,
Who liked this chemical?
in my book.
Who liked the smell?
Who liked the
So
smell?
you can get the academic article. It's called, it's called Why We Love.
How many people didn't get any smell at all?
I think the thing was dried out by the time it came.
No. It's not. It's there. It's very low. Yeah, I've been using this for months.
You just didn't smell it.
So if you can't smell, you can.
So now that we've determined,
Oh, all right.
now that we've determined the people who could smell it were the women and the sensitive men, Siri could give us a final reflection from a psychoanalytic point of view.
When going to participate in this panel, I sort of tried to sum up what to my mind, is the contribution of psychoanalytic thinking to this topic. And I think I sort of was reminded of the great, really radical contribution of Freud's positing sexuality at the center of human motivation as a driving force, what drives us. And I think that it has somehow been lost in sort of modern contemporary psychoanalysis with its relational turn, and that's another topic. But I think this understanding of sexuality as psychosexuality, as a broad, complex concept, embracing human search for pleasure in its manifold and masked and displaced and sort of forms, which brings sexuality out of any normative dimension in a way. To my mind, there is a tendency of today's society, sort of a medicalization of sexuality, to speak of sexual health and to the Viagra question, for instance, being marketed as sort of to restore deficient sexual function, dysfunction, and so on. So it's sort of conceptualized in concepts of health, whereas the Freudian or the psychoanalytic perspective brings it into the field of imagination and fantasy and relationships and emotional interchange, intimately bodily interchange between primary caregivers and the child, determining our pathways and our giving us our specific stamps of the way we seek love and what determines our passion and so on. And also, I thought, coming to the United States, that might be my preconception, but Freud's idea of the infantile sexuality, seeing children's sexuality, their intense curiosity, their imagination, and sort of, I was shocked some years ago when there was this trial or these parents being sued because the 10-year-old boy or something had played with the sister, sort of examining her genitals and playing doctor, and sort of this condemnation or not viewing this as normal behavior in a way. So I think we still need this. These are still radical and disturbing ideas. I think that's challenging to incorporate.
I benefit from these roundtables in a slightly different way, because I try to learn from the scientists what can then help me in my own psychoanalytic thinking. And one of the things I've been interested in more recently has been, and we're going to have a round table on it. I'm not going to be on the round table, but it's a subject that you will hear more about, is in perversions. And what is the role of very early relationship between the mother and the child in creating circumstances where the modulation of anxiety and more aggressive behavior does not develop properly. And that was what I was very interested in what you were saying, because it seems to me whatever happens at that time then determines and colors the whole of the person's life, and all of the life of somebody struggling with perversion is essentially struggling to control anxiety and aggression. And so I find it allows one to begin to see how the one's psychoanalytic way of thinking and the neuroscientific ways of thinking can begin to find common ways of seeing things and broaden our psychoanalytic ways, and maybe occasionally be of some assistance to the lab scientists.
Thank you.
And with that, we finish. Thank you very much for coming all this way. It was good.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philippides events is available at philippides.org.